Westmore Hollow held its breath beneath a heavy sky, the kind of sky that seemed older than the trees and heavier than grief itself. Rain clung to the thatched roofs and dripped in a slow, mournful rhythm from the eaves of houses half swallowed by moss and time. In a clearing just beyond the village proper, where the trees grew gnarled and too close together, a stone cottage slumped into hill as if the earth had grown tired of holding it up. The ivy was thick here, tracing veins down the walls like nature trying to reclaim what sorrow had already half consumed. Inside, the hearth crackled faintly, but the fire was small, half-hearted, and smelled more damp than warmth. Leora sat motionless in a chair that had once been her mother's, and her mother's before that. A chair of old oak and hand-smoothed curves, worn by the weight of women who had waited too long for something to come back. Her hands, streaked with age and soil, rested idle in her lap. The morning had broken in silence, and she had not lit the fire until nearly noon. There was no longer urgency to anything, no rhythm to keep. Since Ruth had gone into the ground, time had splintered. Days passed, but not in any way that could be measured. They simply slipped by like water, and Leora let them. Her daughter's grave sat behind the cottage, beneath the hawthorn tree. She hadn't marked it with a stone, only a ring of white wildflowers that she replanted every week, whether they needed it or not. Ruth had always loved the hawthorn. She used to run circles around it when she was little, her laughter rising like wind in summer branches. The child had a voice made for song, and a mind full of impossible things. Leora remembered that voice, clear as silver, and now the silence that followed was a kind of violence she could not explain. She had once been the village midwife, her name spoken with reverence or fear, depending on the hour of the day. There were women who said she had hands that could pull life from death, others who muttered that she knew more about crossing into the next world than most dared. But since the death of her daughter, no one had asked her for help. No one brought baskets of eggs or loaves of bread to her doorstep. Even the priest, who had offered cold condolences at Ruth's funeral and promised to return, had not darkened her door again. The village, as small as it was, had a long memory and a quiet tongue. They mourned with her in the beginning, then waited for her to return to the world of the living. But she didn't, and so they stopped looking. That morning, the wind had changed. It was not something she heard, but something she felt in the joints of her fingers and the hollows of her bones. A deeper ache, as though the air had thickened. She rose earlier than usual and went to the door without knowing why, her feet bare against the cold flagstones. The rain was soft, a mist more than a storm, yet the forest edge was veiled in a strange, shifting hush. She hesitated before opening the door, fingers pausing on the latch as if her body sensed something her mind refused to consider. When she did open it, the world outside did not rush in. There was only the rain and the quiet and a bundle of cloth on the ground. At first, she thought it was a fox. Her eyes had grown less certain with time, and her imagination, starved and restless, often played tricks. But when the bundle moved, shifted with a jerky, urgent rhythm of breath, her hands moved faster than thought. She dropped to her knees in the mud and peeled back the damp wool. A child, a newborn, swaddled tightly, skin the color of dusk, cheeks pale with cold. Its lips were cracked, its eyelids fluttering, her breath caught in her throat. Not from the shock, but from something deeper, something primal, like a bell tolling in the pit of her chest. The baby made no sound. She scooped it up with hands that had long forgotten the feel of such smallness. The weight of it undid her. There was a smell, milk, moss, rain, and something else. Something that was not Ruth's, but echoed of her. She pressed her cheek against the baby's forehead and staggered back inside, whispering something that had no words. She didn't realize she was crying until she tasted salt on her lips. Inside, the hearth fire barely offered warmth, but she did what her body remembered. She stripped off the wet layers, checked the baby's limbs' heart breath. A girl, thin, hungry, but not starved. Her skin had the fragile sheen of someone who had just arrived in this world, still pink at the edges, still forming. Leora wrapped her in a dry cloth and lit the fire higher, feeding it dry pine until it roared. She found a clean jar, warm goat's milk on the stove, dipped her finger in to test the heat, then hesitated. The bottle, she hadn't used one in years. It took her longer than it should have to find it. She cleaned it with boiling water, cursed softly when her hands shook too hard to screw the lid. The baby whimpered once. It was not a cry, not fully, but the sound pulled her like a hook from inside her ribs. She fed her slowly, held her against her chest, and rocked without meaning to. She hadn't held a baby since Ruth. The light changed by the hour, but Leora barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to the creature in her arms and the impossible quiet of the house that no longer felt like hers. Hours passed. The baby slept, then stirred, then slept again. She never cried, only blinked wide-eyed, as though taking the walls, the wooden beams, the dried herbs strung from the rafters. The child's eyes were the color of stone. Not gray, not blue, but the shifting in-between. Ruth had eyes like that, once. Leora lit a candle when the shadows grew long. The storm outside was quiet now, just a murmur in the eaves. She had not eaten. She did not feel hunger. She sat beside the cradle she once carved herself, the one Ruth had used, and looked at the child for a long time before undressing her fully. The baby squirmed at first, but did not cry. Leora examined each inch of skin, not to find something wrong, but because she had to know what this child was, where she had come from, what the world had written into her already. And then she saw it, on the left shoulder blade, just below the bone. The birthmark curled in the shape of a crescent moon, pale, almost luminous against the soft skin. She reached out, touched it gently, as though it might fade or vanish at contact. It didn't. The mark was real. Leora had seen that shape before, had pressed her lips to it 1,000 times when Ruth was small and sleeping in her arms. Ruth had been born with it, not just similar, identical. Leora sat very still, her breath caught in her chest and refused to move. For a moment, she felt as though she had slipped through time, back into a moment long buried, when Ruth was no bigger than this, and her laughter filled his room like birdsong. But that child was gone, buried beneath hawthorn, turned to dust and wildflowers. This child could not be hers. And yet the mark was there, the shape precise, the curve impossible to forget. Her hands trembled, but she did not put the child down. She stared at the cradle, at the wooden curves Ruth had once grasped, and something inside her gave way. Not a break, but a shift, as if the floor beneath her feet had cracked and become something else. Her mind reached for logic, for sense, for the possibilities of other children, other mothers, coincidences. But her heart, long silent, whispered something else. Not a certainty, not a belief, just a stirring, a question. She named the child aloud, though no one was there to hear it. Eloan, she said softly, as if offering the word to the firelight. It was a name she had once loved, but Ruth had chosen another for herself when she was born. Eloan, she said again, more firmly this time, and the baby opened her eyes. That night, Leora did not sleep. She held Eloan close and stared into the fire until it burned down to embers, and even then, she stayed there unmoving. Something had come to her door. She did not know what it was. She did not dare to hope, but she would not turn it away. In the dark, she sang the old lullaby, the one she had promised never to sing again after Ruth died. Her voice cracked in places, but she sang it all the same. The melody rose like a memory half remembered, like a prayer stitched in the frayed edges of love and sorrow. The baby stirred, sighed, and nestled deeper into her arms. Outside, the rain began again, soft and steady, as if washing something clean. The first time Eloan cried, really cried, it was not a sound but a fracture. It split the silence in the cottage like a dropped glass, startling even the birds nesting in the moss-choked rafters. Leora had been kneeling by the hearth, coaxing reluctant flame from damp birchwood, her hands blackened from soot and splintered by the cold. When the baby's wail rose from the crib, raw, round, fierce, it startled her so deeply that she let the flint fall from her fingers. For a moment she sat frozen, heart hammered with an old instinct she thought long buried. The sound wasn't simply that of hunger or fear. It was demand, life demanding to be heard. It was breath against the grain of death, and in that cry, something in Leora stirred, something she did not want to name. She moved quickly then, her old midwife's hands responding even as her thoughts lagged behind. Eloan was flushed, fists clenched, mouth wide with protest. Leora lifted her gently, pressing the infant to her chest with a tenderness she had once known like a second skin. She had forgotten how light a body could be, how fragile yet urgent, like flame in a wind. The child smelled of milk and skin and sleep, and Leora, without thinking, began to hum. Not the lullaby, not yet, but an old folk tune her mother had used to sing when the cows wouldn't settle and the fire wouldn't catch. The child quieted, slowly, breath by breath. Her tiny body softened into Leora's shoulder. Leora swayed without realizing, the rhythm of comfort engraved deep into her bones. She stared out the frost-blurred window toward the woods that curled like fingers around the clearing, watching how the snow gathered in the elbows of branches and the folds of stone. For the first time in many long weeks, the world felt less like a room locked from the inside, and more like a place where something still moved. In the days that followed, Leora fed Eloan with the devotion of someone clinging not to faith, but to purpose. She warmed milk over fire, checked for fever, rubbed lavender oil behind the child's ears. At night, she placed her in the old cradle, the same one Ruth had slept in, carved from pine, its headboard shaped like a moon caught between clouds. Leora had once smoothed it with her fingers while watching Ruth sleep, memorizing the rise and fall of her daughter's chest like it might vanish as she looked away. Now, 2 decades later, the same moon shape framed another infant's rest, and Leora felt time blur its sharp edges. The past and present leaned too close together. Her hands remembered before her mind did. She did not know why she called the girl Eloan. It had come to her with the certainty of breath, a name that meant elm tree. She remembered distantly, though she had never named Ruth for a meaning, only for a feeling. Eloan felt soft in the mouth, like something not yet broken. It was not Ruth, and that mattered. She would not pretend. This child was not her daughter returned, not some resurrection or trick of the gods. But she was here, and she was hers, if only for now. When the villagers saw her walking with the child, on the 3rd day, wrapped in wool and held close to her chest, they stared. It was at the bakery first. She needed flour. She had not bought any since before Ruth's death. The baker's wife, Miriam, blinked 3 times before handing her bag, her eyes flickering toward the infant with a question she did not voice. Leora met her gaze briefly. Not cold, not sharp, just still. She did not offer explanation. She paid in coin and walked away with the wind at her back. By the end of the week, whispers had found her again. They carried themselves like wood smoke, thin, curling, persistent. Some wondered whose baby she had taken in. Others whispered darker things, that she had gone mad with grief, that she had conjured the child from shadow, that it wasn't right the way the girl looked at you. Leora did not answer the door when people knocked, not even when the priest came with his candle, and asked if she needed prayer. She needed no sermon. She had buried her faith with her daughter. What she needed now was truth and a name. Each night, she watched the child sleep. Eloan's breathing was uneven, the way all infants breathe, but beneath it was a rhythm that began to feel like anchor, like pulse. On the 5th night, as the wind tore through the cottage roof and howled in the chimney like a woman mourning her sons, Leora noticed something strange. The baby's eyes, though not fully open, tracked the flickering light of the hearth with uncanny calm. Not just vision, awareness. Her little hand reached out, not fumbling, but steady, toward the glow of flame as if it knew it, remembered it. That gesture shook Leora more than any cry could have. She watched the fingers extend, hover, then curl again into a loose fist before falling back to sleep. In the stillness that followed, Leora lit 3 candles and placed them at the window, not for show, not for the village, but for whoever had left the child there. She walked the edge of the clearing the next morning, wrapped in her thickest shawl, boots sinking deep into the snow. She scanned the tree line for footprints, disturbed soil, anything. There were no tracks, no broken branches, only silence and a soft trail of rabbit prints that led nowhere. Leora knelt where she had first found the child, pressing her palm into ground, as though some warmth might remain, some trace. But the earth was cold and hard and did not speak. Still, she whispered, "Why here?" The child bore the birthmark. She had examined it again and again, lighting the lantern late into the night, comparing it with the memory of Ruth's pale shoulder. It was identical, not similar, not merely shaped the same. The exact hue, position, curve. A mother does not forget the map of her child's skin. Leora had nursed Ruth through fever, had rubbed that shoulder when the child had fallen, had kissed it every time she bathed her. She knew it with the certainty of breath, and now it had returned, uninvited, on someone else. She searched Ruth's chest the next day, the one beneath the bed where she kept her daughter's drawings, her letters, the pressed flowers she once picked and dried and tied with yarn. Leora had not opened it since the burial. The smell of lavender clung to the wood, mixed now with dust and rot. Her hands trembled as she pulled out journals filled with looping, slanted script. Ruth had always written too fast, her thoughts racing her fingers. Leora flipped through page after page, expecting sorrow, expecting memories she wasn't ready to hold. But then, near the end of one worn notebook, a passage struck her heart like thunder. "I dreamed her again," Ruth had written, "the baby with the moon shoulder. I don't know where she comes from, but she always looks at me like she knows, like she forgives me before I've even spoken." Leora sat back, stunned. She read the line 3 more times, her vision blurring. There was more, a sketch half finished, of a baby in profile. The birthmark was visible. Beneath it, a single word written in soft pencil, Eloan. Her breath left her in a slow exhale. She touched the page, fingertips tracing the lines her daughter had once drawn. Ruth had dreamed of this child, named her, imagined her, or had she known something more? Leora did not know what to believe. Her hands began to shake. The wind howled outside. Eloan stirred in her crib. She stood then, slowly, and went to the window. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that swirled in the wind like ash. The forest loomed beyond, silent and ancient. Somewhere out there was a truth, but here, in her arms, was the only thing she could hold. She turned back to the child and whispered the name once more. Eloan, she said, not as question this time, but as vow. The fire cracked in the hearth. The wind curled beneath the door. The baby opened her eyes. Leora bent close and met her gaze, gray, unblinking, wide with something that felt too deep to name. Not Ruth. No, not Ruth. But not stranger, either. This was not the beginning of something. Not really. It was a continuation of a bond stretched across grief and time, tethered not by blood, but by a single impossible thread. The shape of a moon on a child's shoulder. And for the first time since the grave closed, Leora lit the hearth with both hands. The days began to stretch again, lengthening by imperceptible degrees as the frost retreated from the bones of the earth and left behind the dark, saturated soil of late winter. The woods around the cottage no longer stood entirely silent. Small birds had returned to their low branches, calling out to each other in high, tentative songs that reminded Leora of a life she had once known. But despite the shifting season, the cold still clung to her house like old sorrow, nesting the corners, under floorboards, within the seams of curtains where time had frayed them threadbare. Inside, the scent of milk and lavender had begun to settle over everything, softening the hard edges, replacing the silence with breath and small sounds, a cradle creaking, a murmur in sleep, a rustle of swaddled limbs. Yet even as Leora moved through her days with steadier hands and purpose returning to her limbs like blood to numb fingers, questions pressed against her, quiet but insistent, like fog against glass. She had not spoken them aloud. Not yet. Words made things real, and she feared what might be summoned as she gave form to the storm stirring beneath the surface. But she felt it in every movement, in every glance toward the child who was not hers, and yet had somehow arrived shaped by the very ghost she mourned. She had not meant to look for signs, but signs had found her nonetheless. The birthmark remained unchanged, and each time she bathed Eloan, her hand lingered near it, her thumb brushing gently over the pale arc of skin as if it might suddenly disappear or else reveal something she had missed. The child grew stronger by the day, her cries more insistent, her gaze more focused. She would fix her eyes on a corner of the room and laugh, the soft, bubbling kind of laugh that carried a weightless joy, and Leora would find herself frozen, her throat tight with something she couldn't name. Ruth had laughed like that. Not as a baby, perhaps. Those memories had frayed. But as a child chasing the wind in the orchard, shouting spells to the sky, and naming the trees after imaginary saints. Iloan's voice rang with that same clear note, and it haunted Leora more than silence ever had. Unable to rest, Leora turned to the remnants of her daughter's life. She began to open drawers she had once sworn to leave untouched, sifted through the chest of memories not with reverence but with urgency. She needed to understand what this was, not to find peace. She no longer believed in such a thing, but to steady herself, to orient her grief against this new axis that bent time and memory until they overlapped. She had buried Ruth's diaries after the funeral, locked them in the linen trunk with the belief that memory should remain untouched, that to return would be to bleed again from the same wound. But now she found herself unfolding page after page of her daughter's handwriting, eyes skimming the ink that wandered across the paper with equal parts discipline and wildness. Ruth had always written to understand, even when she hadn't known what she was reaching for. Leora remembered the sight of her at the window, head bowed, lips moving silently as she scribbled, pages scattered around her like feathers. There were entries about the forest, about dreams, about light that stayed too long beneath the trees. There were sketches too, birds, faces, half-formed symbols. One page caught her breath and held it. A child, perhaps a year old, drawn in careful strokes, cradled in what seemed to be Ruth's own arms. The child's head rested against her shoulder, and on the bare skin of the back, Leora saw it again, the crescent birthmark. Below it, Ruth had written, "She finds me in sleep." Always the same mark. A dream baby, maybe, or something waiting. Leora sat still for a long time, the page trembling in her hands. Her thoughts swelled with noise, but her body held its silence. Ruth had seen her. Before she died, she had known this child, or some version of her. Had she spoken of it? Leora could not remember. There were days in those final months that blurred together, Ruth's mood shifting like the weather, her body thinner, her eyes distant. She had spoken of visions then, of strange lights in the woods, of a feeling that someone was calling her. But Leora had dismissed it as grief or madness, or the flaring of soul that did not know how to settle into adulthood. She had tried to tether Ruth to the earth with reason and routine, and Ruth had drifted further away, like smoke from a fire never fully caught. Leora closed the journal slowly, holding it against her chest as if the weight of her daughter's words might press an answer into her ribs. Outside, the wind stirred again, shaking loose a brittle leaf that had clung too long to a branch. She rose and carried the journal to the hearth, where the fire had burned low. She did not feed the flames. She set the book on the table beside the candle and turned toward the cradle. Iloan was awake, staring at the ceiling with that unsettling stillness babies sometimes possess, as if they are listening to a language adults have long forgotten. Leora approached and lifted her gently, cradling her against the faded fabric of her apron. The girl's warmth seeped into her skin, grounding her. She murmured nonsense at first, the way mothers do when the world feels too sharp, then paused, held the child at arm's length, and whispered, "What are you?" The baby blinked once, then twice. Leora did not expect an answer, but her heart stuttered when the child smiled, wide and sudden, as if something had passed between them in the silence. It was absurd. Leora knew it. Coincidence, instinct, projection, all the things a mind does to survive loss. And yet, that smile sat in her memory beside another. Ruth, age 2, covered in flour, giggling from behind the bread bin after stealing a figure. It was not the same smile, but it struck the same chord, the one buried deepest. The next morning, Leora left the house with the baby wrapped tight against her chest. She had not visited the village well in months, preferring to draw water from a forest stream even when it froze her fingers to the bone. But she needed to be seen now, not out of pride, out of necessity. Someone knew something. Someone had left this child at her door, and someone, somewhere, had answers. She walked slowly, her gait stiff in the cold, her eyes lower but alert. The village square looked as it always had. Sagging roofs, muddy paths, sheep half asleep in the field's edge. But the stairs came sharper now. Miriam, at the bread stall, looked away quickly. Elias, the cobbler, nodded once and then turned his back. Only old Rill, the widow who lived nearest the chapel, called out, "That child yours now, Leora?" Leora paused. She could have lied, said she was minding someone else's, said nothing at all, but she turned and answered plainly, "She is mine to care for." Rill squinted, wiped her hands on her apron. "Looks like your roof. Around the eyes." Leora did not reply. She turned and walked on, heart racing. The market buzzed faintly behind her. Words she could not catch. Let them talk. She had let them talk when Ruth was alive, when the girl had come home barefoot from the forest with pockets full of stones and eyes full of questions too large for her age. They had always watched Ruth sideways, as if expecting her to break the world open with a word. And now they would watch alone too. That night, Leora searched the back shelf of the cupboard for Ruth's old toys. She found them wrapped in cloth, preserved with strange care. Wooden animals, a doll with one button eye, a bundle of feathers tied with red thread. She laid them out beside Aloan, watched the baby kick, and coo at the shapes. She reached for the doll first, fingers curling around the worn fabric, as if she remembered it. Leora sat down slowly, breath caught in her throat. Later, as darkness gathered beyond the windows and the wind moaned in the chimney like a distant voice, she lit a candle and opened Ruth's diary once more. She traced the lines of that drawing, the child with the crescent mark. Her eyes stung, but she did not weep. Instead, she whispered again, not to the air, but to the child in her arms, to the one who had come to her from nowhere and yet brought every echo with her. "I don't know what you are," she said, "but I will not let you be lost." And the wind, for once, did not answer. The morning the stranger arrived, the sky held a strange kind of stillness, the kind that hangs just before snow, when the world forgets to breathe and every branch, every blade of grass, stands waiting beneath a quiet far older than the wind. Leora had woken early with a tightness in her chest she couldn't name. It wasn't illness. She knew the maps of her own body too well for that. It was something deeper, older, the way animals sense storm before clouds arrive. Aloan stirred in her sleep beside the fire, her breath soft and rhythmic, her little fingers curling and uncurling in dreams. Leora sat near the window with her tea cooling beside her, staring past the trees toward the bend in the river that marked the edge of the village's trust. People rarely came from beyond that line. When they did, they carried news, grief, or trouble. It was late morning when she saw him. Just a shape at first, moving slowly through the mist. Tall, wrapped in a dark traveling cloak, the hood drawn up against the cold. He didn't hurry, and that was the first thing that unsettled her. He walked like a man who belonged here, though she had never seen it before, and she had not seen many unfamiliar faces since the funeral. He moved with the calm of someone who was not lost, but returning, a man who had already walked this road in his mind many times. She watched him come closer, step by step, until the frost crackled beneath his boots. He did not stop at the chapel. He did not turn toward the tavern. He came directly to her gate. Leora's hand moved instinctively to the iron latch. She did not open the door. She stood behind it, one hand pressed flat against the wood, as though she could keep something out through sheer stillness. She waited, and then, without knocking, the man called out, not loudly, not harshly, just plainly, as if announcing the weather, "I'm looking for the midwife." His voice was not one she recognized, but something in its cadence made her stomach twist. She opened the door slowly. He stood there, a man perhaps in his late 30s, though it was difficult to tell. His hair was dark and too long, curling beneath the edge of his hood, and his face was the kind worn down not by time but by absence. There was something vacant in his expression, something that made Leora feel as though he was only half present, as though the rest of him still lived somewhere he could not return to. "I'm Leora," she said carefully, her eyes narrowing. "There's no one else here." He nodded, not surprised. "They said as much in the village. I came to ask about a child." Her body tensed, and her hand slipped instinctively to the edge of the door, ready to close it if the words turned wrong. "What child?" she asked, though she knew already. He paused then, hesitating in a way that was almost tender. "I heard," he said slowly, "that a girl was left here, a baby, a few weeks back. I thought it might be her." Leora didn't move. Her heart was loud in her chest, but her face remained unreadable. Her. I don't know her name, he said quickly. I don't even know if she's real. I've been having dreams. I know how that sounds. But there's a child in them, always the same. A little girl with dark hair and a mark on her back. A birthmark, like a crescent moon. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cold crept into the open doorway, curling around Leora's ankles like a warning. She could hear Alolan shifting behind her, a soft sound, no more than the flutter of cloth. Why are you dreaming of her? Leora asked, her voice low, uncertain. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know anything anymore. Only that I wake with her name in my mouth. Alolan. Her breath caught, and she could not hide it fast enough. He saw. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture relaxed, the smallest uncoiling of tension. Please, he said. May I see her? Leora stepped outside and closed the door behind her. The air was sharp, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She studied the man, his posture, his hands, the subtle tremble in his breath. He was not dangerous, but he was dangerous to her. What's your name? She asked. Tomer. She repeated it silently to herself. Ruth had never mentioned anyone named Tomer, but the name felt familiar in the way old songs do, unplaceable, but lodged somewhere deep. I don't know what brought her here, she said. She was left on my doorstep in the rain. No letter, no face, just a locket around her neck. And that mark, the same mark my daughter had when she was born. Tomer's eyes widened slightly. Your daughter? She died, months ago. Her voice was flat, not defensive, but final. Her name was Ruth. Tomer blinked as though the name struck him. He turned his face slightly, as if trying to place it against some half-lost memory. Ruth, he said softly. She was part of the Hollow Circle, wasn't she? Years ago. Leora stiffened. She was a child. That group, whatever it was, found her when she was too young to know better. They weren't dangerous, Tomer said quickly, gently. Not the way people said. We weren't cultists. We believed in dreams, in patterns that carried across lives. Leora narrowed her eyes. You were one of them? Once, he admitted. I left too. Before she did, I think. We never met, but I remember her name. And I remember that others spoke of her. Said she had dreams about a child with a moon mark. Said she thought the child would find her one day. She did, Leora whispered, only too late. Tomer looked down, his face shadowed. I've had those dreams too, only recently. I didn't know what they meant. I thought I was losing my mind. Then someone in the village said a baby had been taken in by the midwife. And I came. You didn't leave her? Leora asked sharply. You didn't? No, he said. I only heard. But I knew. When I heard the name Alolan, when I said out loud, it felt like something remembered, not invented. Leora wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how far she had drifted from the shore of anything rational. But something in her, something fragile and stubborn, refused to turn away. She's asleep now, she said. I won't wake her, but you can come back tomorrow. Tomer nodded slowly. I will. He turned then, walking back down the path the same way he had come, his figure disappearing into the pale morning fog. Leora stood for a long time after he had gone, her breath visible in the air, her mind a storm. That night, she didn't sleep. Alolan lay curled in the cradle beside her bed, breathing softly, her hand tucked beneath her cheek. Leora sat in the rocker and stared at the fire, which had burned down to a soft orange glow. She thought about Ruth, about the journal entries, about the sketch of the baby, about the way her daughter had spoken in those final weeks about return and light and a voice in the forest. She thought about Tomer and the strange stillness in his eyes, about how grief draws lines between strangers, about how her world, once so defined by what was gone, now teetered on the edge of something terrifyingly unknown. At some point in the night, Alolan whimpered in her sleep, and Leora leaned forward, brushing a hand over her tiny forehead. The child shifted, then sighed, and settled again. Leora watched her chest rise and fall, watched the moonlight slant across her skin, and wondered, not for the first time, whether some souls are drawn back not by will, but by need. Outside, the snow began again. Quiet, steady, endless. Leora had never feared silence. But in the weeks following Tomer's visit, it began to take on a different shape. It no longer wrapped itself around her like an old companion, soft and familiar. Now it pressed in from the corners of her house with an edge sharpened by knowing that Ruth had dreamed of Eloan long before she was born or not born, or whatever this strange undoing of time had become. Knowing that Tomer carried pieces of a story she had refused to believe in, fragments of the past Ruth had once tried to explain with the language of dreams and longing and half-spoken symbols Leora had dismissed as the meanderings of a girl too wild to root herself in the earth. Now silence didn't soothe. It listened. It held its breath alongside hers, as if waiting for something more. Eloan had begun to change. She was still just a child, impossibly small, impossibly soft, her fingers curling like ivy tendrils around Leora's thumb, her breath sweet with milk and sleep. But there were moments, fleeting but unmistakable, when her gaze caught on something that wasn't there, where her attention drifted not like a baby's scattershot wonder, but like memory. Once, while Leora sang her to sleep, Eloan turned her head slowly and fixed her eyes on the empty cradle in the corner of the room, the one that had once belonged to Ruth, and had remained in use, half buried under a linen sheet that fluttered only when the wind found a crack in the shutters. Eloan stared as if she recognized it, as if she was waiting for someone to return to it. Leora tried to bury her unease in movement. She swept the floors twice a day, gathered herbs in silence, prepared meals with the rhythm of ritual. But the questions rose with every task. Who had left Eloan? Why had she been sent here? Why that mark, that name? She had asked herself these questions every day, but they now echoed louder, framed by the knowledge that Ruth had written about this child long before her death. It wasn't coincidence anymore. It was intention. And somewhere inside that intention was a truth Leora feared she had spent too long resisting. It was in the back of Ruth's wardrobe, beneath a false plank, that Leora found the letter. The wardrobe itself had remained untouched since the burial. Leora had folded her daughter's clothes with care, tied them in muslin bundles, but never could bring herself to burn them or give them away. She had kept them for no reason she could name, only some instinct that memory needed a place to rest. When she shifted the wood and found the hollow space behind it, she felt no surprise, only the slow sinking sensation of something inevitable. The letter was folded neatly and sealed with a piece of red thread, not wax, as though it had been meant only for someone who would know not to break it carelessly. The handwriting was Ruth's, clear, urgent, slightly slanted. Leora read it by candlelight, alone, with Eloan asleep beside her. Tomer, if this reaches you, it means the dreams have begun again. You'll understand when they do. I don't expect you to remember me, but I remember you. I remember what we try to believe in, and I know now it wasn't madness. I've seen her, the child, in dreams, in light, in the edges of sound. She's coming. Not for me, not really, but through me, through all of us. I can't explain it without sounding like I've lost my grip on the world, but maybe that's the point. Maybe what we held was never the world to begin with. If she finds you, or if you find her, just know this. She won't be what you expect, but she'll be real. She'll be more real than anything else. Tell my mother that I tried, that I left everything I could in the path behind her, and that love sometimes comes back wearing different skin. Ruth. The candle trembled as if her breath had moved it, but she hadn't breathed. Not fully, not since the first line. She sat for a long time, the letter resting on her lap, the firelight casting Ruth's words back at her as if they'd been carved into stone. Love sometimes comes back wearing different skin. The phrase struck her like ice, not because it was strange, but because it sounded so much like something Ruth would say. Something she would say when she wanted to comfort Leora and challenge her at once. She did not cry. The grief she carried had grown past tears. It was quieter now, buried beneath layers of muscle and routine, but it throbbed, steady as heartbeat. She folded the letter and placed it beside the old locket, which still hung above the hearth. The locket had not been hers or Ruth's, of that she was sure. It was unfamiliar, worn silver etched with a tiny tree, the roots stretching downward into a pattern Leora had only seen once before, on Ruth's drawings, when she had begun tracing strange shapes in her notebooks, claiming they came from dreams. She lit another candle and walked to the cradle. Eloan's breath was slow, deep. Leora watched her sleep and wondered how it was possible to feel such love for a child who had arrived with no explanation, no origin, only echoes and impossibilities. She remembered Ruth's last days, how her daughter had grown quiet, too quiet, her eyes turned inward, speaking less and dreaming more. How she would wake in the middle of the night with her palms pressed flat to her chest, whispering names she refused to explain, names that Leora now realized were not hers to speak. She rose before dawn the next morning and made the journey to the chapel. The priest was young and wary, his sermons dry and cautious. He met her with polite discomfort, his eyes straying to the bundle in her arms. "I want her baptized," Leora said before he could speak. The priest frowned. "There's been talk." "I don't care," she said. "You don't have to believe what they say. You just have to hold the water." He hesitated. "We don't even know who the child's mother is." "I do," she said, her voice steady as stone. "Her mother was my daughter, and now she's mine." The priest looked down at the child. Eloan stirred, eyes fluttering open. In the pale light of the chapel, her skin glowed almost translucent, and the birthmark on her shoulder seemed to pulse with soft warmth, not light, not exactly, but the suggestion of it. The priest stepped back. "I'm not sure I can." Leora's voice broke then, not with grief but with certainty. "You don't need to understand her to bless her." He agreed, finally, with a nod and a sigh. The ceremony was brief. No congregation, no hymns, just the three of them and the sound of water poured from a chipped clay bowl. Leora held the child close as the priest touched her forehead, speaking words that had been spoken for generations over children who had come from nothing and would return to nothing. But this time, the words fell heavier. When the water touched Eloan's skin, she did not cry. She smiled. As they left, Leora passed old Rill at the chapel gate. The woman's face softened as she looked at the child. "She don't seem like a curse," Rill said. "Not to me." "She isn't," Leora said. "She's something else." That evening, Toma returned. He brought with him nothing but a small leather satchel and a face drawn taut with unspoken weight. Leora didn't ask him why he'd come back. She opened the door and let him sit by the fire. Eloan slept in the cradle, and Tomer stared at her for a long time before speaking. "She's more than a dream," he said finally. "Yes. I think I knew that," he whispered. "Even before I met her. I think we all knew." They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling softly between them. Leora handed him the letter Ruth had written. He read it without speaking, his lips moving slightly. When he finished, he closed his eyes. "She believed," he said. "She tried to make me believe." Leora answered. "I wouldn't." She wasn't wrong. No, just too early. That night, after Tomer left, Leora stood in the doorway long after the snow had begun again, watching the sky for signs of something beyond the storm. Not visions, not answers, just signs that love might indeed wear many faces, many names, and sometimes return in silence, waiting to be named again. The snow had not yet melted when the orchard burned. It was early spring, or what the calendar insisted was spring, though the ground was still hard with frost and the wind had not yet softened. Leora had begun to walk with Eloan each morning again, wrapped tightly in wool. The child pressed against her chest, the steam of their breath mingling as they moved beneath bare-limbed trees. The orchard stood beyond the chapel hill, where old pear and apple trees arched their crooked spines toward the gray sky. It had been Ruth's favorite place as a child. She would run between the rows, her laughter bright against the silence, naming each tree as if they were sisters, weaving stories for the ones whose branches had snapped in storms. Even as a girl, Ruth had believed the trees could hear, could carry secrets in their roots. Leora never shared that belief, but she had indulged it because it made Ruth glow in ways that nothing else did. Eloan had begun to babble in the mornings, little strings of sound that bore no shape but carried a rhythm that felt old, as though she were reciting something long forgotten. Leora listened with her heart clenched tight, half in wonder and half in dread, as the child whispered the leaves in light and her own fingers, her eyes fixed on spaces in the trees that Leora could not see. It had become a ritual, Their silent walks through the orchard, the only place where Leora felt the weight of her questions ease, as if the roots beneath them accepted the unspoken. It was there, in that quiet grove, that she first felt hope rise without warning, uninvited and dangerous. She never let it settle, but it followed her home like scent clings to skin. The fire began just after dusk, when the shadows lengthen and the wind carries more than cold. Leora had just settled alone into her cradle, the fire warm in the hearth, when the sky flashed orange through the window panes. At first she thought it was sunset, though the light had not come from the west. Then she heard the bells. The chapel bells, wild and uneven, rung by hand in panic. She wrapped herself in her cloak and ran barefoot into the night. The frost slicing at her skin, the sound of the bells echoing through the hollow. Smoke curled above the trees, like a wound splitting the sky. The orchard. Her feet knew the path before her thoughts did. By the time she arrived, half the trees were already gone, their blackened arms reaching skyward like mourners caught mid-prayer. Flames danced along the trunks, hissing through bark and branch, devouring blossoms that had only just begun to bud. Villagers stood in clusters with buckets, forming a weak line from the well. No one spoke, only the crackle and the shouting of water orders. Leora stepped forward, eyes wide with disbelief, and the crowd parted around her without touch. No one stopped her. No one offered comfort. She stood before the blaze and felt its heat rise against her cheeks like accusation. The orchard had not burned on its own. That much was clear. The snow around the trunks was untouched, except where the flames had melted it. No lightning, no stray candle. It had been lit deliberately, with purpose. There were no torches now, no signs of who had done it. But Leora could feel in her bones. This was not an accident, not the cruelty of nature. This was a message, a boundary being drawn. Later, after the flames were extinguished and the ground smoldered beneath boots, she stood beside the ruined trees and listened to the silence left behind. Someone approached her. She did not turn, but she knew the voice. "You bring strange things into this village, Leora," said Mela, the blacksmith's wife. "You always have." Leora said nothing. "The child is not yours. Not really. You know that." "She was left to me," Leora said softly. "That makes her mine. People are afraid." "Of a baby? Of what she means." Leora turned slowly then, meeting the woman's eyes. "Then let them be afraid." She walked away before the conversation could deepen, her cloak heavy with smoke. The air tasted like ash and old fruit, and her feet bled where the stones had cut her. She did not notice. When she returned home, Eloan was still asleep, her tiny body undisturbed by the chaos beyond the walls. Leora sank beside the cradle and watched her for a long time, her mind replaying the fire, the heat, the look in Mela's eyes. Not hatred, but fear. Deep, ancient fear, the kind that grows not from understanding, but from absence of it. The next morning, a stone was thrown through her window. It happened before dawn, the sound of shattering glass slicing the silence like a scream. Leora was already awake, rocking Eloan softly, singing beneath her breath. The stone landed near the hearth, wrapped in a scrap of cloth that smelled of oil. No words, no markings, just a raw weight of thread. She picked it up calmly, unwrapped it, and placed the stone on the table. The glass she swept into her hand with careful, practiced motions. This, too, was a ritual now. When something breaks, you gather the pieces before they cut deeper. She did not tell Tomer. He visited twice that week, bringing books and warm bread, sometimes speaking, sometimes only sitting. He watched Eloan with a reverence that unnerved her, as if each movement the child made was part of scripture he had long forgotten how to read. She wanted to ask him if he had enemies, if someone in the village blamed him for what had come, but the words felt wrong in her mouth. He seemed so quiet, so haunted by his own unraveling. To accuse him would be to accuse Ruth, and Leora was not ready to carry that weight. Instead, she turned inward. She cleaned the windows, replanted the garden, began teaching Eloan to grasp her wooden toys. She sang the old lullabies without flinching, letting the sounds fill the house until even the silence began to feel smaller. She went to the chapel again, alone, and stood in the back during service, though no one acknowledged her presence. The priest looked at her once, his eyes filled with flicker of doubt, and she nodded to him, just once, as if to say, "Yes, I am still here." One night, as a storm rattled the roof and the wind dragged itself against the shutters like a wounded animal, Eloan spoke. Not a word, not a name, but sounds so deliberate, so shaped, that Leora dropped the ladle from her hand. The child had been playing with a feather doll Ruth once made, turning it in her hands, watching the way the downy tip caught the firelight. Then she looked up and said, clearly, softly, "Ma." Leora froze. The room went still. "Say it again," she whispered, crawling to the cradle. Eloan only blinked, but she smiled. Tears rose without warning, not the sobbing kind, not grief, but the slow, unstoppable kind that comes from recognition, from the sense that something is broken and mended in the same breath. Outside, the wind died. The fire whispered low, and Leora, for the first time in months, let herself speak without fear. "I don't care what they think," she whispered to the child. "You're mine. You always were." She slept that night with Eloan in her arms, the stone still on the table, the window repaired with boards. She did not dream. She did not need to. The dreams were here now, breathing beside her, calling her Ma, and nothing the village burned could take that away. The storm broke on the 7th night of the new moon, and with it came a wind that did not feel like weather. It had a weight to it, not merely of air but of memory, as if it carried voices that had not spoken aloud in years. Leora felt it before she heard it. The way the house shifted, how the floorboards creaked not from cold but from pressure, as though the world itself leaned closer. Eloan stirred in her sleep, her small limbs tensing briefly before relaxing again, as if something had brushed against her in the dark. Leora lay awake long after the wind had died down, staring at the ceiling, her hands folded over her chest, the warmth of the child's breath at her side keeping her tethered. Her mind turned over the pieces that had begun to surface, the fragments that had drifted upward like bones from thawed soil. She had begun to see a pattern now. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to know that Eloan was not an isolated blessing or curse. She was part of something larger, something that threaded itself through Ruth's final days, and further back still, to old stories that no longer passed between the mouths of villagers, but that lingered all the same, half remembered and half feared. It was Tomer who finally gave shape to the shadow. He returned one afternoon with a slowness to his step, his eyes darker than usual, as if he had spent the night walking in a place without light. He did not carry bread or books this time, only a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth, the corners bound with faded red twine. Leora met him at the door and stepped aside wordlessly. Eloan was asleep in the crook of a blanket near the hearth, her small hand curled over her own thumb. Tomer looked at her, not with reverence this time, but with something closer to all mingled with guilt, the way one might look a relic they had once helped to bury and now found unearthed, unchanged. "I went back," he said after a long silence, "to the coast, to what's left of the place we lived." Leora poured water into the kettle and set it over the fire. She didn't speak, waiting instead for the words to form in him fully. She had learned that grief had its own pace, and that truth, when forced, became story. "It's gone," he said. "The old farmhouse, the stone circle, even the well, all of it reclaimed. Ivy dust salt, as though it had never been. But the records were still there, tucked into the altar stone. Names, drawings, transcripts of dreams. We kept them back then, cataloged them, in case," he hesitated, shaking his head as if embarrassed, "in case we could find a map in them." Leora raised an eyebrow slightly, motioning for him to sit. "And did you?" He opened the box. Inside were papers, worn and discolored, some with ink so faded it looked like blood soaked into linen. He pulled one free and handed it to her. It was a sketch, faint but familiar, a woman with a child cradled against her chest. The child had a mark on her shoulder, the same crescent Leora had traced on Eloan 100 times now, each time half hoping it would disappear. "This one's dated 15 years before Ruth was born," Tomer said, "drawn by someone named Mireia." She described the dream in exact detail. The locket, the birthmark, The child named Aloan. Leora stared at the paper. Her breath slowed, her chest hollowing out beneath the weight of too many impossibilities collapsing inward. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Is it prophecy? Reincarnation? Are we ghosts playing at motherhood?" Tomer's voice softened. I think it's memory. Not ours. Not fully. But something deeper. The soul, maybe, or a current that runs beneath the world, carrying parts of us forward, not like people imagine it. Spirits walking again, but echoes, imprints. Sometimes the world repeats itself, not in punishment, but in offering. A second try. Leora looked at him then, the way a woman might look at the face of someone who once left her behind in the dark. "And what did you do with your first try?" He did not flinch. "I ran. I was young and afraid, and I believed more in the dream than in the people who shared it. I thought love would distract me from purpose. That Ruth was the one walking away, not me, but she stayed longer than I did. She believed longer. She believed until it killed her," Leora said, the bitterness rising uninvited. "No," Tomer said gently. "She believed, and it brought her here. To you, to Aloan. Not everything that ends is a failure. Sometimes it's a seed." The fire snapped softly behind them. Leora looked down at the sketch again. The mother's face was not Ruth's. Not hers either. But it was familiar. A shape seen in the corner of a mirror, or remembered in a dream that slips away at waking. "You think Aloan is Ruth?" "I think Aloan is herself," Tomer said. "But I think she carries Ruth. In her bones. In her breath. In the way she remembers things she's never seen." Leora exhaled slowly. "Then why was she left at my door?" "Because you're the one Ruth trusted to love what was impossible." The words silenced her more than shouting could. She looked at Aloan, still sleeping, her breath even and soft, her face peaceful. And she thought of all the nights she had stayed awake, terrified of losing something she could not name. All the mornings she had walked the grave and whispered into the earth that she wasn't ready to say goodbye. Maybe this wasn't goodbye. Maybe it never had been. Tomer placed the box on the table and stood to leave. "I'll stay nearby," he said. "If you'll have me, I don't need to be in her life. I just want to be near enough if I'm called." Leora nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was enough. That night, she opened the rest of the box. Pages and pages of dream records, most written in hands unfamiliar to her, but all echoing the same imagery. A child with a moon mark, a woman singing a lullaby beside a fire, a cottage surrounded by trees that bend toward the wind as if listening. There were dozens of sketches, dozens of names. Some had dates, some did not. Some were signed with initials, some left anonymous. But the message was the same. Aloan had been seen, again and again, long before she came into Leora's arms. She was not an anomaly. She was thread. In the last fold of parchment, Leora found a page written in Ruth's hand, though the ink was thicker, the letters slower, as if written in pain. It was not a letter. It was a prayer, not to any god, but to the earth itself. If she comes back, don't make her remember everything at once. Let her laugh first. Let her sing. Let her sleep without fear. And let her be held by someone who knows how to stay. Leora pressed the paper to her chest and wept. Not for Ruth, not for Aloan, but for the space between them. The space that had once been filled with silence and now pulsed with a quiet, enduring rhythm of return. Outside, the wind calmed. The trees bent gently. And the child stirred in her sleep, whispering something no one could hear, but which Leora understood all the same. The fever came with no warning, as sudden as wind through a window left ajar. It began in the quietest hour before dawn, when even the birds held their breath and the fire in the hearth had burned itself down to a bed of pale embers. Leora had been dreaming of water, cold and black, rushing fast through a narrow gorge, her daughter's voice somewhere within it, not calling for help but calling her name with a tone of calm urgency, like a child who has found something beautiful in a place no one was meant to go. When she woke, it was the silence, not peace, but an absence of sound so complete that it struck her chest like panic. She turned immediately to Aloan, who lay limp in her cradle, her breath shallow, her skin damp and hot beneath Leora's touch. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused, as though following a movement behind her eyelids. Leora lifted her into her arms, whispering her name, trying not to let her voice break, trying not to summon fear into a room where only instinct could be allowed now. The fever had come like a thief in the night, and it had brought with it something more than illness. Leora could feel it the way animals feel a coming storm. This was not a child's fever. This was a reckoning. She moved quickly. Years of tending the sick had carved protocols into her bones. She stripped the child gently, swaddled her in cloth soaked with elderflower and cool stream water, crushed dried yarrow between her palms, and added it to a bowl of steeping chamomile. Her hands worked as her mind unraveled. She could not remember Aloan crying. The girl had cried when she first arrived, those first few nights when breath was still uncertain, when her body had not yet belonged to the world. But now there was only quiet, a stillness too complete. The child's limbs hung too loosely, her face flushed with heat that pulsed from beneath the skin like light from behind fabric. Leora whispered every name she had ever known for healing, for mercy, for hope. She lit 3 candles and placed them on the windowsill, one for Ruth, one for Aloan, and one for the space between them where some unseen thread remained. She opened every window despite the cold. Let the wind move through the house, brushing across the child's skin like a baptism. Still, the fever climbed. Aloan's breath grew ragged, her lips pale. Leora sat on the floor and cradled her, forehead pressed to the child's, tears slipping silently into her hair. By nightfall, Tomer had come. He did not knock. She had not called him, but he arrived anyway, drawn by something he could not name, or perhaps by a grief he had learned to recognize without sound. He entered without speaking and knelt beside them. He looked at Aloan, at the fire guttering the hearth, and then at Leora. "She's crossing," he said, his voice hoarse. "She's not dying. She's choosing." Leora looked at him sharply. "Choosing what?" "To stay, or not." Leora shook her head. "She's a child. She doesn't choose. We do. We choose for them." "Not this one," he said. "She's carrying too much." "What do I do?" Leora whispered. Tell me what I can do." Tomer rose slowly. "You remember." He began to walk the room, hands out, touching the walls, the beams, the floorboards. "You call her back with what made her, not with medicine, with memory." Leora felt something old stir in her chest, something she had buried the day she buried Ruth. She stood, still holding Aloan, and walked to the hearth. She reached up and took the locket down from its place above the mantel. It was warm in her hand, as if it had been waiting. She opened it. Inside, still tucked within the silver shell, was a curl of Ruth's hair she had kept, and a flower petal that had long since dried into a whisper violet. She placed the locket in Aloan's palm and folded the child's fingers around it. "This was your mother," she said, "and you were hers before you were mine." Tomer lit a fire then, one larger than usual, and fed it with dried sage and pine needles, the room filling quickly with a sharp, earthy scent of something that was neither incense nor offering, but a call. Leora began to speak, not in prayer but in story. She told Aloan about Ruth's first laugh, how it had burst out like music in the orchard when she had seen a butterfly land on her thumb. She spoke of the way Ruth had insisted on naming each of the chickens after stars, and how she had once slept for 2 days straight after reading a book on ancient dreaming, convinced her body was catching up with her soul. She spoke until her voice cracked, until her throat was raw, until the air itself seemed to hush around her. And then she sang. Not the lullaby, not yet, but the old song from Ruth's childhood, the one Leora had sung to the herbs in the garden, to the wind when it knocked against the shutters, to the soil when she planted seeds. A song with no words, just hum and rhythm, old as the trees. Tomer joined her. His voice was rough, uneven but steady. The fire flared. The shadows on the walls shifted, no longer dancing, but gathering, listening. Aloan stirred. It was a twitch at first, a small spasm in her leg, then a sigh. Her brow furrowed, her lips parted. She let out a breath like a soft moan and turned her face into Leora's chest. The fever had not broken, but it had lessened. Leora could feel the heat retracting, not vanishing, but giving space. Again, Tomer said, "Don't stop." Leora continued. She sang through the night, her voice threading in and out of silence, sometimes barely more than breath. She recited Ruth's letters. She read from her daughter's journal. She opened every drawer in the house and pulled out scraps of cloth Ruth had worn, poems she had half finished, a spoon she had carved with her own initials when she was 12. She placed them all around Eloan, building a circle not of salt or stone, but of remembrance. By morning, the fever had broken. Eloan's skin cooled. Her breathing evened. Her eyelids fluttered open. For a long moment, she stared at Leora with eyes not dulled by illness, but sharpened by return. And then she reached out with one small hand and touched Leora's mouth, as if to say, "I heard you." Leora wept then, quietly, the way a mother weeps when her child is not taken, the way a woman weeps when a door closes softly and the monster waiting beyond it chooses, at last, to walk away. Tomer left without a word. When Leora looked for him later, the path was empty, but the box he had brought remained, and inside it, beneath the papers, was a stone with the same root mark etched into the locket. She placed it on the windowsill beside the candles and did not question its meaning. That evening, as she rocked Eloan to sleep, she sang the lullaby, the one Ruth had always loved, the one she had promised never to sing again. She sang it now not as mourning, but as welcome, and the child closed her eyes and smiled. Spring came early that year, as if the land itself had been waiting for something to return before it allowed itself to soften. The snow melted not with its usual reluctance, but in swift, silent withdrawal, revealing black soil eager to breathe again. Crocuses pushed up through the frost-bleached earth like small, defiant miracles. The orchard, though scarred and blackened by the fire, began to stir at its roots. Green shoots crept along the trunks where ash still clung, and the smallest buds appeared at the tips of charred branches. Quiet and determined, it was not rebirth. Exactly, it was survival, the kind that carried both wound and will within it. The villagers said nothing to Leora, but she noticed the small signs. Bundles of dried herbs left on her step, a pot of honey quietly placed near the garden gate, someone mending the path leading from the chapel to her door with freshly laid stones. No apologies were offered, but in the unspoken, something shifted. Not acceptance, but recognition. A slow, grudging respect for the woman who had refused to abandon what the world had deemed cursed. Eloan began to grow into her body with sudden speed, as if the fever had burned away whatever barrier had kept her hovering between this world and the one beyond it. Her limbs lengthened, her gaze sharpened, her laughter became a new music in the cottage, bright and echoing, full of some joy that Leora could not understand but clung to all the same. The child no longer stared into empty corners or spoke to unseen things. Instead, she began to live. Not just breathe, not just survive, but live. She crawled through rooms with relentless curiosity, touched everything, called the names of things before Leora had taught her. She named the wooden spoon Allah. She named the wind Row. She named the cracked blue mug that had once belonged to Ruth Mama, and would press her lips to it and hum softly, a sound that never failed to tighten Leora's chest. The birthmark on her shoulder, the pale crescent that had once felt like a doorway, began to fade, slowly at first like fog lifting, until it was no longer visible in low light. By midsummer, it had become a mere whisper of pigment, still there if one knew to look, but easily mistaken for shadow. Leora touched it often, gently, reverently, as if afraid that when it vanished completely, the thread that tethered Eloan to Ruth would vanish too. But the child never flinched. She seemed unbothered by the change, as though it had been expected, even planned. Leora tried not to read too much into it, tried not to believe that she was losing Ruth again, inch by inch. But grief, even softened by time and filled with new breath, is a thing that never lets go entirely. It waits, it watches, and it always keeps one foot at the threshold. The garden flourished more than it had in years. Leora planted new seeds at spring, not with any great hope, but because her hands needed to do something other than hold fear. She expected little. The soil had been choked by frost and ash, and her heart was still weighted by uncertainty. But the shoots came fast, eager, bold, sunflowers the size of small moons. beans that twisted skyward with furious green, lavender that bloomed with a sweetness so strong she could smell it from the forest edge. Eloan loved the garden. She would sit for hours beside the raised beds, running her hands through the basil and thyme, giggling when the bees landed near her wrists. She did not pluck or destroy. She observed, as if the world to her was not something to consume but to understand. Leora often sat beside her in the dirt, watching her daughter's eyes track ants in clouds and the movement of the wind through grass. Ruth had done the same once, though never for as long. Ruth had always been searching. Eloan seemed to be listening. Tomer returned quietly, like everything else that belonged to this new rhythm. He did not ask to stay, nor offer to leave. He simply appeared sometimes, on the path, beside the well, carrying baskets or books or nothing at all. Eloan took to him without hesitation. She would reach for him when he entered, press her forehead to his in a gesture that neither Leora nor Tomer had taught her. Sometimes she would fall asleep in his arms, as if it were the most natural place in the world. Leora watched them together with an ache that was not pain, but something older, something like longing diluted by peace. She did not speak to Tomer about the past, nor did he ask, but once, while repairing a shutter together, she looked at him and said, "She's not Ruth." He nodded. "I know. She's not yours either." "No," he said softly. "She's her own." And in that answer, Leora felt a kind of blessing. As the orchard continued to regrow, she began taking Eloan there again. The first time, the child stood very still at the edge of the clearing, her small fingers wrapped tightly around Leora's. Her eyes swept over the scorched trunks, the half-healed earth, and the new leaves unfurling against black bark. Then she let go of Leora's hand and walked ahead barefoot, placing her feet carefully between the roots, as if following a path only she could see. She stopped at one of the oldest trees, the one Ruth had called Solna, and pressed her palm to the trunk. For a long moment she was silent, unmoving. Then she laughed, not loudly, but with that same pure sound she had made as a baby, the sound that once echoed in the night and made Leora freeze in place. This time Leora smiled. Eloan turned and ran back to her, arms open, her eyes bright. "Tree's not sad anymore," she said. Leora picked her up, heart stammering. "No," she remembers now. They visited the orchard weekly after that. Sometimes Leora brought a basket and they picked a new fruit, small, firm, a bit bitter but growing sweeter each week. Sometimes they brought books and sat beneath the branches, Eloan curled in her lap, fingers tracing the letters on the page. She had not yet learned to read, but she followed the lines as if she understood something deeper than words. Once, she pointed to an illustration of a woman holding a lantern and said, "That's you, when you were looking for me." Leora could not answer. Summer waned slowly, the light lingering longer than it should have. The days were golden and heavy with warmth. Eloan spoke more now, full sentences, questions, declarations. She asked about the moon, about why the fire was hot, about why some trees bent and others stood straight. Leora answered what she could, and when she could not, she said simply, because that's how they are, and Eloan accepted it with a nod. Some things, it seemed, did not need explaining. By early autumn, the villagers began to greet Leora in passing again. A nod from the miller, a smile from Miriam, who once would not meet her eye. Children waved from behind fences. No one spoke of the fire. No one asked about the child who had come from nowhere with a name already written across her soul. But they no longer looked away. Eloan walked with Leora through the village without fear, her hand tight in hers, her feet skipping over stone and grass, as if this place had always been hers, and perhaps it had. One evening, just before the last harvest, Leora stood at the edge of the orchard and watched Eloan chase a falling leaf. The wind lifted her hair, tangled it across her cheeks, and for a heartbeat, just one, Leora saw Ruth, not in Eloan's face, not directly, but in the way she moved, in the joy that lived inside her. Not a ghost, not a reincarnation, but something like an echo made solid. She did not call her back. She let her run, and when Eloan turned and shouted, "Ma, look, it's dancing," Leora only smiled and whispered, "So are you." That night, after Aloan had fallen asleep curled in the crook of her arm, Leora sat by the fire and unwrapped the locket again. She did not cry. There were no tears left for mourning, only for gratitude. She placed the locket back on its hook, where it would hang, not as a symbol of what had been lost, but of what had returned in another shape. Then she kissed the child's forehead, whispered her name, and allowed herself, finally, to rest. The days had grown shorter again, and the light that poured through the cottage windows in the early hours had turned from gold to gray. Autumn had deepened into its final weeks, and the land began to quiet in that particular way it does before winter, no longer heavy with harvest, but hushed, spent, and leaning inward. The last of the apples had been pressed, the lavender cut and hung in bundles above the hearth, the garden beds cleared of all but thyme and rosemary, which clung stubbornly to the soil. Smoke rose steadily from a chimney each day, and the air smelled faintly of pine, of worn wool, and of something gentler still. The scent of home after loss has been made livable. In the mornings, Leora lit a small fire not because the house demanded it, but because she had learned, in these quieter seasons, that warmth is not always necessity. Sometimes it is simply a promise, an offering to the silence that lingers between footsteps and stories. Aloan was for now, though time did not move for her the way it did for others. She measured it not in hours or seasons, but in songs and the names of trees that had changed color again, in the weight of a rain-heavy sky, and in the stories Leora told at night before sleep. She had not asked again about Ruth. Not directly, but sometimes she would run her fingers along the edge of the old wooden cradle, or pull down one of the journals from the shelf and leaf through it with the strange gravity of someone who cannot yet read, but knows that meaning lives in the shape of things. Once, as Leora knelt to tie her boots for a walk to the chapel, Aloan reached out and touched her cheek gently and asked, "Was I your first or your second?" Leora had not answered right away. She had looked at the child, this bright, soft, wild creature with eyes like dusk and a voice that could already carry silence the way some voices carry melody, and she felt the ache rise up like a tide. "You were always the only one," she had said at last. The rest was waiting. The days passed gently now, not without labor. There was always bread to bake, water to carry, wool to spin, but the rhythm had grown into something that no longer scraped against her grief. It ran alongside it, like two rivers winding toward the same sea. Tomer visited less often but never vanished. Sometimes weeks passed without a sign of him. Then he would return with a new story, a pouch of herbs he'd traded for at a distant market, a wooden toy he'd carved in the shape of a fox or a bird or a star. Aloan would run to him with the joy of someone greeting a long-lost song, and Leora, though she never said aloud, came to understand that some forms of absence are not abandonment. They are simply the shape of someone doing their best. The villagers had folded them back into their quiet rituals. Leora still carried a shadow wherever she walked. Some wounds remained visible even after they've scabbed, but she was no longer the subject of wary glances or closed doors. They brought honey and oats in winter, left sprigs of rosemary on her doorstep in spring, asked after her garden when the rain came late. She did not explain what Aloan was to them. She did not need to. The child walked among them with the ease of someone who belonged, and no one dared speak otherwise. Some said she had been a miracle. Others believed she was penance. But whatever stories they carried, they did not ask her to change, and for that, Leora was quietly thankful. The lullaby returned on its own. Leora had not planned to teach it, had never written down the words. They had lived only in her breath, passed from her mother to herself, and briefly, to Ruth. She had sung it once to Aloan, in the depth of that fevered night, when the child's life hung like mist between the worlds. After that, she had tucked it away again, afraid of what it might mean to give voice to something so fragile, so soaked in memory. But children remember in ways adults forget. They remember tone, cadence, the color of a sound. And so one morning in early winter, as Leora stirred the porridge and Aloan sat beside the fire with her doll wrapped in linen, the child began to hum. Soft at first, tentative, but unmistakable. Leora turned, wooden spoon in hand, and froze. She watched as Aloan hummed the first few notes, brow furrowed in quiet concentration, then sang the line she could not have known, in the exact same lilt Ruth had once used, down to the upward inflection on the last syllable. The same rhythm, the same gentleness. She had never taught it. She was certain. The fire crackled behind her. The kettle whistled softly on the stove, and Aloan sang the lullaby as if she had always known it, as if she had carried it with her through the long dark before she arrived at the cottage door. Leora's knees gave slightly. She gripped the edge of the table and let the sound move through her, unresisted. She did not interrupt, did not cry. She only listened. When the child finished, she turned and looked up at Leora, her eyes questioning. "Did I do it right?" she asked. Leora knelt beside her, took both of her hands in her own, and nodded. "Where'd you learn it?" she asked softly. Aloan shrugged. "I heard it when I was little." "You are little," Leora said, smiling through the ache. "I mean before," Aloan said, placing her hand over her chest. "In here." That night, Leora took down the locket for the last time. She opened it slowly, as if it might protest, and looked once more at the dried petal. The curl of Ruth's hair, the softness of a thing preserved not for beauty, but for meaning. She kissed it once, then closed it and wrapped it in cloth. She placed it inside a wooden box carved with stars and set it in the drawer beside the cradle. It was no longer needed. Ruth's memory no longer lived only in objects or absence. It had moved into the child's voice, her laughter, her silence. It had grown roots in Aloan's steadiness, her patience, her strange, fierce love for every broken thing. The first snow fell that evening, light and sparse, brushing the cottage roof like ash. Leora sat by the window, Aloan curled on her lap, both wrapped in the same heavy shawl Leora's mother had once worn. The fire burned quietly beside them. The room smelled of cinnamon and wool, of cedar smoke and sleep. Outside, the trees bowed under the sky's weight, and the orchard beyond the clearing stood quiet, its limbs strong with waiting. Leora thought of the life she had lived, the one that had started in a different version of the same cottage, when she was young and unafraid, when Ruth had been a miracle she hadn't understood how to hold. She thought of the years that followed, of the silence that grew like mold in the corners of the house after Ruth's death, of the ache that had hollowed her into something more stone than skin. And she thought of the morning Aloan arrived, swaddled in wool, placed at her door like a question without punctuation. She had never asked why. Not truly. She had only accepted. Now, in the quiet of that snow-laced room, with Aloan breathing softly against her chest and the world outside folding itself into rest, she allowed herself the answer. Not why, but what for. Not punishment. Not redemption. Continuance. The world did not offer second chances. It offered continuation. Thread woven through ash and joy alike. A story not restarted but carried forward in a new voice, a new body, a new song. Aloan stirred in her sleep and mumbled, "Sing it again." And Leora did. She sang the lullaby with her full voice this time, not afraid of what it would summon. She sang it not as a eulogy, not as a tether to the past, but as a gift to the present, a song for what was and what remained. A song that could live in both her daughter's memory and her granddaughter's breath. And when the song ended and Aloan slipped into a deeper sleep, Leora whispered a single word into her hair. "Stay." Outside, the snow continued to fall. The world hushed itself in reverence. And inside, two hearts beat steady, one old, one new, neither alone.